aye, please.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Visitors requesting permission to address the board. Let me go ahead and read through this. Visitors requesting permission to address the board on a specific agenda item other than consent items should raise his or her hand, wait to be recognized by the president, and then state his or her name and the public agenda item which he or she wishes to address. The board respectfully requests a discussion time limit of 2 minutes on any specific agenda item. Visitors are asked to restrict their appearance to 1 appearance per item. It is requested that each person requesting an audience with the board speak to the podium and that their name and address be stated before beginning their comments. For board policy, personnel issues will not be addressed. Concerns about individual employees of the district shall be brought to the superintendent or designee. Is there anyone in the audience tonight that would like to make a public statement or comment?
Yes.
Under what item would it be?
Under the audit.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes.
Audit.
Audit. And what's your name, sir?
Pat Roberson.
Anyone else?
I would just like to thank you for holding this informational meeting, and I'd appreciate it if all board members would introduce themselves to anyone that don't know who they are. Thank you.
Anyone else? Thank you. Mr. Nick?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay. You just want to state your name and what township you represent? Go ahead.
Chris Nipple, Rock Creek Township. William Greenblatt, Liberty Township. Good evening, Gil Smith. I represent Deer Creek Township, City of Delphi.
Neil Anderson, Madison Township.
Mike Graves, Newtown Township.
Kurt Schwarzkopf, Jackson Township. Steve Myers is not able to be here, and he's the other Deer Creek board member.
Nicholas Otis, the attorney for Delphi.
Thank you. Approval minutes, not August 19th, 2019 special session. Looking for a motion.
Mr. President, I move to approve the minutes as presented.
Second. Okay, we have a motion and a second on the floor to approve the minutes of the August 19th, 2019 special session. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye, please.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Number 3, the Resilient Youth Initiative Student Survey. This survey is part of our Resilient Youth grant that we received and we approved, I believe, last meeting, or last regular meeting we had. Everyone should have gotten a copy of this survey. Basically, it will be given to all high school students. It is on the internet where they will do this. It's not a paper and pencil type thing. The results will be tabulated and sent back to the school. But this is part of that grant that we received, and Mrs. Kirkwood, that's pretty much what we need. Okay,
It will be anonymous, we won't know who filled out what.
thank you.
Can you advise, will that go out as a link to students, community, or just a notice to go someplace and find it?
Mrs. Circle and I have not set up exactly how we're gonna initiate it. My guess would be during an OT at some point with the students involved.
That's strictly current students?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Looking for motion.
Mr. President, I move for to allow our high school to perform the Resilient Youth Initiative Student Survey information.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. on the Resilient Youth Initiative Survey. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye, please.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Internal audit update. This evening we have Mr. Ed Eiler, Dr. Ed Eiler with us. He's been working with us for a month or so, I believe. He's going to go through his findings, and after he has gone through his findings, when I open the discussion, we'll have questions from the two gentlemen. Okay, Dr. Eiler, would you like to?
How about now? Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to compliment everybody here. I really appreciate the fact that there are enough people in this community who care enough to come and learn more about your financial situation. I do have to make some clarifying comments to begin with. One is, this is referred to as, I think it was mentioned that it was an audit. This is not an audit. An audit has to be performed by a certified public accountant. The purpose of an audit is specifically to check to see whether or not all the laws or the rules and regulations, procedures of the district are in compliance with the state laws, rules and procedures set forth by various accrediting agencies. You have just had an audit completed through, I believe, June 30th, 2018. There were 3 findings. The first finding was the fact that certain charges for example, that were being charged to the transportation fund, as an example, principals and assistant principals supervise bus dismissal, which is a perfectly permissible thing to charge to transportation. Your treasurer, assistant treasurer has the responsibility to do payroll and process various bills and claims, and so it's appropriate to charge things. What you have to do is you have to have adequate documentation for the time that's spent that you're charging. The State Board of Accounts said you need more complete documentation. Next year, this is a moot issue because next year, the transportation fund, operation fund includes transportation administrative costs, so it's all going to come out of the operations fund, so it's really a moot point at this particular point in time. The second finding dealt with when you actually received the prepaid cafeteria funds and treated as revenue in your cafeteria fund. State Board of Accounts says you can't really count it as revenue until they actually spend it in the cafeteria. The third finding was that there were some negative cash balances on June 30th. I don't know which funds they're talking about. They said that did not appear as though they were in anticipation of anticipated receipts. That could be a matter of just how funds were transferred internally, I don't know. But I think you'll understand more about the cash position of the school district at the end of the evening. I would say generically, the school district has not spent any funds for which it is not authorized to spend. It is, I think, it's critical to understand what appropriations are and how appropriations and actual cash work with one another. Appropriations are the authority to spend money, and the board cannot spend money that they have not been authorized to spend. Appropriation approval is granted by the Department of Government and Local Finance. What you do is you have a hearing, and you have to prove to the hearing officer that you have this money. And then the hearing examiner says, okay, I believe you, I believe the certification you have, those numbers make sense. You have the authority to spend this much money. And spend more than that without demonstrating that you have more money. At the same token, just because you have the authorization or appropriation authority, you always have to check to make sure you actually do really have the cash for the appropriation authority that you have, because you can have the authority but not have the cash. So you constantly have to monitor those things. So those are two kind of ideas that I want to plant early with you. And so this is a disclaimer that basically sets forth that this is really a financial analysis. I'm trying to help the board understand where you are financially. And I think I'd like to begin with the cash flow issue. And I'm not going to insult your intelligence or the intelligence of the board, but if you'll turn, there's one of your handouts is labeled cash flow. Board members, if you would look at that, since you don't have eyes in the back of your head, you can see what people in the audience can read. But the first page of the cash flow basically tries to explain why it is that you're in a position that you are in terms of your cash position. And for board members, if you would turn to the next page of that handout, it is, had I known this was quite the format, I would have done some things differently so that the audience could see as well. But board members, if you were to turn to the second page, this is a little revision of the document I gave you the other evening, but if you look in 2018, and it's in the middle of the page, the second page there, this document looks like that. It's the second page you do the cash flow now. Everybody got the right page? Turn to the second page. Now, if you go to the middle of that page, you'll see these are the revenues and expenditures in 2018. And you see what's happened in the general fund. You started out with a beginning balance of $177,000. You have revenue of $9,704,000, and so the total money that you have available is about $9,882,000, so as you number. You spent about $9,876,000, which, when you compare the expense column to the column that says just revenue, the revenue is the amount of money you got during 2018. The reason you were able to spend more, slightly more than actual revenue that you got during the year, is because you used some carryover beginning balance. And so that's why your expenditures in your general fund were slightly higher. Compare that ending balance in 2018, $5,938, with the ending balance in the general fund in 2017 up above. You see that it was $177,000. So you're $170,000 less in the general fund to start the year, 2018. Go down to CPF, transportation and bus purchase. Again, your expenses for the year exceeded the revenue you received during the year, and the reason you were able to do that is because you used the beginning balance carried over from the previous year. You see the ending position of those funds, and in part, you can see that the ending position for the CPF was $15,000, transportation $76,000, bus purchase $133,000. Compare those numbers to the 2017 ending balances that year of $383,290, $191. You can see that you spent more money. You had the money and you spent it. A lot of it was in capital projects fund. I don't know what projects you completed, but you can see that reduced your cash position. So at the beginning of this year, you look at your beginning balance at the bottom of the page on 2019 was $1,457,000. The year before, the beginning balance was 2,234,000. So you started out the year about 800, whatever the actual number was that you saw on the first page of the report. You started out 853, 590 behind, and then you also, in terms of your hearing for the debt service fund, what took place there was, at the time the budget was advertised, the treasurer did not know the exact amount of the debt payment for the GO bond for 2018, so she made an estimate of 500,000. The actual amount was 748,000 something. It was about 248,000 more than that. What happened then, the hearing examiner did allow that. He saw that the actual payment was higher, and he gave it to you as an operating balance. Had the budget been advertised with the full amount or a higher amount, you would have gotten that as a levy as a part of your budget, and then you would have been permitted to have an operating balance, which is determined by, I'm sorry for all the detail, but you have allowed for debt that's, I think, older than 1992. You're allowed to have less of 50% of the payment or the actual payment during the first 6 months of the year, which happens to be $204,000. You're allowed to have 50% of debt issued, or 15% of debt issued after 1992, I think it is, or the actual payment that's due in the first 6 months. Well, your payment for the 2018 bonds isn't due until December, so the amount is really zero that you owe them. That's 6 months. So you have basically $204,000 that you could have as an operating balance. Had you advertised higher in terms of the actual payment, you could have had a couple $100,000 more in operating balance, because you would have had the actual amount of the lease payment up above, and you would have at least an operating balance of $200,000 as it is. You do have an operating balance, but it is only enough to make sure that you have enough money to pay your lease payments. That's a pretty complicated way to tell you that your cash position is worse than it was a year ago. And because of that, that's the reason that you need to borrow money. You probably might even have been able to get through September. There are two things that would make things even more complicated this year. One is you're making a transition in terms of the fund accounting system. In the past, you had a general fund, capital projects fund, transportation fund, a debt service fund, and bus purchase fund, and a rainy day fund. Going forward, you have a rainy day fund, general fund, debt fund, pension bond fund, and then what the legislature did is they combined the CPF, transportation, and bus purchase funds into one fund, and they required certain expenditures that had previously been paid by the general fund to be moved to operations funds. So this is a year really of tweaking and adjusting as to how much exactly should you put in education, how much should you put in operations. The legislature has passed a bill that said that if you spend 15% or more, if you transfer 15% or more from the education fund to operations, you gotta have a plan starting in 2020 as to what you're gonna do to reduce that percentage so you can get down to 15% or less being transferred from education to operations. So, the end result is that your cash position is considerably worse. And you probably could maybe able to get through September, but part of the complication is the district has elected to change accounting software, and on June 30th is the last month that we have where you actually have closed the books, so you know exactly where you are. As a result, it's a little difficult because you don't have July or expenditures in August to know in terms of your exactly your expense and cash position. And so it would be a better estimate if we had that information. So that makes things even more complicated. And looking at your cash flow, I gave you 2 large sheets because it's easier to see these big sheets than it is the smaller sheets. This is the previous treasurer's cash flow projection. One of the sheets, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, it says that it is I'm trying to tell you how you can tell the difference. Okay. One of them says, where it looks at expenditures, it says transferred operations. It's highlighted and it's bolded under expenditures. One of them says transferred operations. That sheet is the education fund. The other sheet is the operations fund. But I draw your attention to October. This is the position that the previous treasurer said that you would be in October. In October, you would be negative $412,895 in operations, and negative $24,845 in the education fund. That's about $457,000. When you looked at her projections in June, you're actually about $100,000 less well off in June than she had projected. So you're probably a little worse than that. But since we don't have reports for July and August, I can't confirm exactly where you are, so try to be relatively cautious. The amount of money that you can borrow in terms of calculating the maximum cumulative cash flow deficit is that negative balance there plus your expenditures the following month. If you look at November expenditures in the operations fund, they were to be $369,000, and in the education fund, $715,000, which is about $1.1 million. So when you combine those two, it's about $1.5 million in terms of the amount of money that you borrow. And the reason this is not that an unusual situation, I know it sounds like a lot of big numbers or whatever, but because the property taxes are paid and are collected and paid to the districts in May and November, districts always spend money ahead of when they receive their tax draws. So most districts, many districts are in a position where they borrow money. So this is not an unusual event. The fact that you borrow the amount that you do is in the event that in November, for any reason, you were not be able to get your tax collection, you would have enough cash on hand that you can pay payrolls, pay your claims, pay your bills. And so that's in case you might not need it if you get your tax draw early in the month. You don't need that amount. And what will happen is this amount will be repaid when you receive your property tax draws. This is a temporary loan during the year. It is truly for cash flow purposes. It does not represent a structural deficit. It just says that your cash position is such that you need to borrow money. So I provided some additional documentation for the board about some of the other numbers that's in that handout that I gave you labeled cash flow. So I thought that's one of the elements in the room, and I wanted to address it head on. So what I want to do at this particular point in time with the board is to walk you through now in terms of look at the handout that says financial analysis. It was the one that was on top when I handed you your packets. Yeah. Thanks. Let's begin. We're going to work through the funds that are supported by state and local taxes. The federal funds are funds that you expend the money are reimbursed, like Title I. The special ed funds and so forth currently, those grants have been written by the cooperative. The first one we're going to look at is the rainy day fund. there are certain numbers on certain forms that are more important than other numbers on certain forms. One of the first things you get is you get a budget order. It's called a 1782 budget order, and it tells you what appropriation authority you have to spend as a result of the hearing, and we'll go into all the details as to how it comes up with this number. But the DLGF said, we're gonna give you $734,398. Well, on December 31st, your cash balance in that fund was $581,000. That's not $734,000. It's a logical question of so why is that the case? Well, it's because you spent some rainy day fund in the last 6 months more than you thought you might, and so it reduced the money that's truly available. Remember I said you have to match, make sure you got the money to support the appropriation. You have approval to spend $734,000, but you don't have $734,000 to spend. You had 581. There have been some expenditures out of the fund already. So your present balance is $538,000. I was informed that it needed to reserve about $30,000 for the Leader in Me program, which leaves about $508,000 that could be spent out of the rainy day fund during 2019. Now, one of the things that I asked for was the original resolution that created the rainy day fund sets forth the purposes for which the rainy day fund might be used. To this date, no one's been able to find the original resolution. So my suggestion would be the board needs to adopt a new resolution saying that how this money can be used, which could include uses for educational fund expenses. So that's some of the realities about the rainy day fund. You have about $508,000 that could be used provided that the resolution permits it for education expenses. The debt service fund, I explained to you that the budget order came $1,487,000, and you were given $1,792,000, and with your cash balance and so forth, you have enough money to pay your lease payments, but you will have to advertise an additional appropriation. If you turn the page, it looks at the budget order itself. The actual hearing examiner says at the end, it tells you that you have to advertise an additional appropriation. I have some supporting documents here. It's called supporting documentation. Page, let's see, on the budget order, it says that the rate and/or levy was increased to provide necessary funds for debt obligations in the current year. So if you look at what they approved $248,000 some odd dollars that you will need to have an additional appropriation hearing and appropriate it, so you will have enough money to pay your lease payments during 2019. So that's another to-do thing on your list. Appropriation, you need an additional appropriation of $258,616. You may actually, based on what I just learned this evening, just before the meeting, part of the reason it's a little higher than that was because perhaps the action you're going to take with reference to the loan, you might need a little more loan interest to pay, maybe $2,000 or $3,000. So you might actually need to increase that appropriation amount a little bit so you have enough appropriation to pay the interest on the loan. Now, before you also have to realize that during the window of time when you receive the money until you actually expend it, there'll be a period of time where you have a fair amount of money that will be gaining a little interest, and these days it's very little, but you'll gain a little interest that will help offset the cost of the interest costs for that loan. fund is pretty straightforward. It allows you to levy large enough to pay your pension bond debt, and your appropriation is sufficient to do that. So there really isn't any action that's required on the part of the board or treasurer or anyone in terms of your pension bond payments. I want to spend a considerable amount of time, because now we're getting to the funds that are really important, which are the education fund and the operations fund, to find out where you are. Okay? First thing is, if you look at the budget orders, the budget order said you had authority to spend $8,483,067. And again, remember I said, it's one thing to have the authority, the other thing, you actually have to have the money to support the appropriation. When you look at the chart of accounts that the treasurer established, for whatever reason, she set it up at $7,950,000. There might be some good reasons why she set that up that way. I have a hunch, I'm guessing, I know what the reason might be, but it may have involved in part her notion about your ability to carry over encumbrances. But one of the reports that's missing, and some of the reports have been a little challenging, it's taken me a little longer to do some things, is that there was no appropriation report run on December 31st, which would tell me whether there were any encumbrances on that date, which then, the reason that's important is that those can be carried over in that appropriation. You can increase your appropriations by the encumbrances carried over. In terms of revenue in the education fund, your cash balance on December 31st was $5,937. In your documentation I provided to you, if you look at if you go to the document that you were looking at in terms of the cash flow, and if you look at it's probably the third page from the end, it's entitled Fund Report Levy. Looks like that. And in terms of the cash flow document, if you look at your cash flow document, look at the third page from the end. What that is, this is what the DLGF, that's their certified document with reference to where you stand. When I refer to line 8B in that document, what line 8B represents is what the DLGF says, that's the amount of revenue you're going to receive during the calendar year. We certify that that's a number that you have been able to prove enough documentation that we say we will allow you to have that amount of money. And if you look at your form, on the bottom left-hand corner, that is the education fund. And you can see line 8B says $9,414,956. However, you passed a resolution that said that we were going to transfer to operations $1,560,000. Now, you don't have to transfer that amount, but that's the resolution that you passed. You were going to transfer that amount, which means the net amount of funds that is available for the education fund was $7,859,000. Now, if you look at, go back to your, the analysis report and look at the operations fund, I'm sorry, the education fund. It says projected expenses and addressing the need. On June 30th, in the education fund, it showed on the report, and I gave a copy of that, it's included in some of the supporting documentation, that you had expended $4,576,000. The previous treasurer's estimate was $4,577,000. That is a pretty good estimate. It's pretty close in terms of the first 6 months. However, there are some things in terms of the June 30th is the only thing that we've got to go on in terms of trying to project expenditures. And it's a little daunting to say, okay, we're going to project the next 6 months, but we have to work under some assumption. And so you kind of appreciate the assumptions that we work. Number one, in the first 6 months, you had some one-time expenses that will not recur the last 6 months. One of those was your special ed cooperative payment and the one-time contribution to the HSA accounts. That was $365,000 that will not occur the last 6 months of this year. Now, it also treats as an expenditure the transferred operations, and that does not affect your appropriation. A transfer of cash does not affect your appropriation, so that's not a true expenditure. It's a transfer of funds. Because the legislature passed the law that said that they would pick up, they're reducing the teacher retirement contribution required in school districts from 7.5 to 5.5. That 2%, it will be lowered 2%. Your contribution toward total teacher retirement fund is about $300,000. Not knowing, I'm guessing it, since you have so many younger faculty members, that if 75% of those people were in the new fund, which is the fund for which they're picking it up, not picking it up with the old fund, that if 75% of the teachers in the new fund, that would be about $225,000. If 7.5% is $225,000, then 2% is about $60,000 or so that you would be paying less for the year. So for the last 6 months, your reduced expenditures for teacher retirement will be about $30,000 less. Subtracting those things, saying the expenses for the last 6 months, if that were the case, would be about $4,056,000. The previous treasurer estimated those expenses for the last 6 months of $3,702,000. I hope she's right. At this particular point in time, I'd rather be conservative about what it is the expenditures are than and without July or August even looking at it in terms of what your expenditures are. It's difficult to guess is exactly what they are, but hopefully they will be less than that. But assuming that they are the higher number that I've used just based upon the 6 month projection, your total expenses for the year would be about $8,632,000. If you remember the revenue that we talked about on the previous slide was $7,859,000. That means you're short of having enough cash and appropriation to meet these proposed expenditures. Now, we do have $508,000 available in the rainy day fund. If you reduce the transfer to operations by $265,000, so it is no longer $1,560,000, but $1,295,000, that would mean you could increase. You don't even have to have that much appropriation because you already have authority to increase your appropriation. But your education fund appropriation will wind up being $8,124,000 by increasing it by not transferring that same amount to operations. Now, there's some merit to doing that because you're going to have to look at some game plan to get it below 15% anyway. If you're at $9,400,000, you're probably looking at what, 13.1 anyway. So you want to get it below about 13,000, $1,003,000, I should say. And so that would get you about where you need to be in terms of being at your 15%. So, turning our attention now to the operations fund and working through some similar kind of scenario, the budget order provided for $4,561,000. You did have some encumbrances, and remember what I said, your encumbrances can increase your appropriation. So the maximum appropriation that you could have would be $5,014,000. Currently, the chart of accounts is set up at $5,437,000, which is beyond the budget order, and beyond the budget order plus encumbrances. Looking at the revenue side, again, line 8B provides, that's the revenue that you're gonna get during the year. Of $1,912,000 includes the $1,560,000 transfer from the education fund. If you include the beginning balance of the three funds this year, CPF, transportation, and bus, which were folded into operations, that's about $225,000. Property tax generated about $2,935,000, for a total of $5,074,000. If you reduce the transfers we talked about earlier in the education slide, then you would have a maximum revenue of $4,809,000, which means your chart of accounts, your master chart of accounts would need to be reduced to $4,809,000. You'd have to live with that number. As of June 30th, it's spent $2,487,000. The previous treasurer had estimated $2,298,000, but the solar payment is not in that $2,487,000. It was in her estimate, which means that the expenses are running higher than she had anticipated. Again, you have some one-time expenses for property and casualty insurance. You purchased a bus and other vehicles. If you were to reduce the amount of expenditures in the last 6 months for equipment, and I had told Mr. Briles and the treasurer that for me, I would not purchase any equipment out of the operations fund, but if we had bond money, I would use the bond money. You have about $160,000 was really in there. It says central office remodeling. You have two numbers. You have $165,000 twice. So you have some. It really is your emergency allocations or something come up. But you are already into August. By the time you actually encounter bills or whatever, you probably would be able to get by with less an appropriation there. Assuming all those things, subtracting them, I'm guessing your last expenses for the last 6 months would be $2,070,000. Previous treasurer had estimated $1,943,000, but we do have to take care of that solar payment. So the total expenses, $4,809,000, which you go back, which matches the revenue that you have available. To do this, you got, in order to complete all the things I just told you, that you need to limit your equipment purchases. And you've already transferred $125,000 from education to operations. So you still need to transfer $1,170,000 from education fund to the operations fund for the balance of the year. And you need to monitor your property tax collections, because the circuit breaker last year, you reduced your revenue because of the circuit breaker by about $100,000. So that would mean that your revenue from property taxes could be reduced by $100,000. Now, moving forward, if I were sitting in the chair of needing to do something, I would reduce the transfer operations. That $265,000, I'm saying don't transfer this year, I would make that a permanent reduction. I would just say we're not going to transfer that ever. Second thing I would do is say that, I'll go ahead and list the other things. Next year, the other half of the teacher retirement fund reduction would be recognized, which would be about $30,000. Again, if you did not attribute additionally to the HSA, that's $165,000. That was an expense this year that might not be an expense next year. Mr. Briles has already made some staffing adjustments that resulted in savings of about $40,000 next year. In terms of the operations fund, this is a critical piece because it works two ways. It is permissible because your debt for your solar agreement is below $5 million. The board can take some steps and be able to pay that out of the debt service fund. And if you were to do that, that would have the dual-edged sword of reducing the amount of transfer that you would have to make out of education to operations, so that that money could be left in the education fund, and it would reduce the expenditure in the operations fund by the same amount, because you don't have to pay it out of operations, so that you can pay it out of debt. So if you look at that $263,000 plus the other measures up above, excluding the first step of the reduction in transfer, you have about the $500,000 that you need to make up, because you're using $500,000 of rainy day funds. The other thing that you should examine doing is to look at issuing a small bond for the purchase of your equipment, particularly technology, and making it a taxable bond so you can go back and recapture some expenses out of your operations fund. If you have a bus purchase or technology or whatever, you could easily come up with $360,000 more of recoverable expenses that then you could reimburse the operations fund. And that's about where you are in terms of, if you go back and look at the operations fund, you actually have about $4.6 million of revenue. You're about a couple $100,000 of having revenue with that kind of an expenditure plan. That, doing something like that could probably get you in a position where the revenue and expense are about in alignment with one another. But you're going to need to talk with bond counsel and your chamber, whatever they're called these days, to ascertain exactly what steps you need to take and the timing of those steps in terms of when they can be accomplished, because I'm not a bond counselor. I don't know exactly how those two intertwine, but I do know that you do still have some geo bonding capacity left, a couple $1 million of geo bonding capacity left. Now, generically, there are some things, just as looking at it, coming in as an outsider, that you need to continue to doing your cash flow analysis so you know where you are in terms of your cash position. In the future, you'll need to issue a tax anticipation warrant for your cash flow needs, and that's something that you could probably begin in October, do something in November. Something that has to be done is the banks need to be reconciled with the funds every month, and the reports that are run need to be run at the same time at the end of the month, so you know exactly where you are, because currently they are not. And then finally, as board members, two things you need to look at on a monthly basis. One is fund balances. So you should get a report of fund balance each month, and you can look at the expenses and revenues and the fund balance each month. And then look at the appropriation. You want to keep track of how appropriation are running and whether or not you have revenue to support the appropriation, and you're not spending more appropriation or spending more money than you have appropriation approval for. And that is one of the fiduciary responsibilities that you have as board members. Now, finally, if you go back to that cash flow sheet, that handout on the second page, if you did all these things, I just suggest you would be awfully close to having an expenditure plan pretty close to your revenue. Extremely tight. I'm not saying you got all kinds of wiggle room here, but it would be extremely tight. But you can see at the end that this assumes that your ending balance in the education fund would be $1, rainy day would be 0, and your total cash balance on December 31 is $125,000. But going forward, you do have a plan that you have your expenditures in line with revenue, and you have not. You're confronted with the same situation that virtually every board does. Is you got to figure out, as you get more and more information about expense and revenue, what adjustments do we have to make in order to get our better alignment, to make sure that our revenue and expenses are in alignment. To the extent that you can issue a GEO bond and go back further, that's probably the best way you can try to go about reestablishing a rainy day fund. So, in addition, the board did ask a few additional questions that they asked me if I would look into, and I have provided some responses to those questions. One dealt with cafeteria fund, and I did hand out to you a cash flow sheet from the cafeteria fund. The previous treasurer had projected that by the end of the year, you would have a cash balance of about $104,000. Looking on June 30th, you're actually a little ahead of schedule. If that's the case, you probably have some funds that could be used for capital expense or some of the issues that you wanted to look into in terms of some of the issues of cost that you brought up with reference to the cafeteria. I gave you some other options that you can follow, but if the cash projection is true, you don't really need to take any of those other options. I think one of the questions was also about money that might be available for negotiations. I think that that is ultimately a decision that the superintendent and treasurer board have to make. I would say at this point in time, there is a way to get an expenditure plan in alignment with revenue. If funding formula were to generate additional dollars, that would be, at this particular point in time, I think something you can negotiate about. You also asked whether or not it's required in terms of when you ask for construction bids, is it an idea that you have to have 20 previous jobs listed so that you can be eligible to have a bid? Well, the state of Indiana says that if a project is less than $300,000, you don't have to specify the number of projects. If it's more than $300,000, then you do have to have at least 5 during the last 5 years. The reason that most people ask for more than that, if they've had 5 projects in 5 years, you want to make sure that there are enough projects that you can identify projects of the scope of which you really have to. If somebody has had 4 small projects and 1 large one, that's not sufficient enough information to know whether or not they are a qualified contractor. So it's not unusual for architects and other people to request a larger number of bids to be eligible for a public works project. There was also some question about outsourcing for bus maintenance, and it appears that I provided some information about the amount of expenditures to date for the contractor. It appears, and again, you'd have to run this by your attorney, it appears, for just as a cursory reading, that you have a 5-year agreement, and the first time you could cancel the contract if you wanted to would be 90 days before November 1st, 2023. But I've given you copies of the language about that agreement. Asked how do we compare financially today compared to 3 years ago. Obviously, your cash position is considerably worse than it was 2 or 3 years ago. Things are, I think, described as very tight. I think that with the steps that I've talked to you today, you can come up with a game plan that does match expenditures for revenue, but it's going to take all those measures. I was asked about credit cards, and this is not an audit. I want to make clear this is not an audit. I didn't check to see how credit cards were used, but having just had an audit finished by the State Board of Accounts on June 30th, that's normally one of the things they do check. There was no citations. The bigger issue is your procedures and your policy probably needs to be revised so that you can keep a better track of exactly what obligations are out there by part of the school district. And I've given you some suggestions in terms of things that you can do to modify your board policy to ensure that you have a quicker turnaround and proper documentation and how you can monitor it. So that's included in some of my comments. You also said looking at special education, having been a part of a cooperative that is dissolved. The one issue that I think is worthy of some additional thought and consideration is still whether or not there should be some attempt to do some cooperative for the low incident programs, because those are extremely expensive and you may not have that child today, but you could have them tomorrow. And it kind of serves as some form of protection if all of the districts will look at something regarding the low incident programs. I have told the board that all of this information is available. I can give them electronic copies of everything. You're free to do with it whatever you want to. If you want to post it on the bulletin board or post it on your website, make it available. Certainly will be available to the board, and you may use it however you'd like to. So that concludes the report. I'll be glad to answer questions from the board.
Dr. Eiler, I have a quick question here. Not that it would change the situation, financial situation that we're in right at the moment, but had we been aware of this 2 or 3 months ago, would we be going down the route of an emergency fund right now?
No, I mean, I think if the treasurer had not left, given what you know now, you would probably issue the tax anticipation warrant. And this, again, this is going to be repaid before the end of the year. If a loan were not repaid by December 31, that's a problem because you become a controlled school district. But this is, you'll repay this when you get your property tax draw in November. And I think that the reason that it's an emergency loan is because you don't have time to issue a tax anticipation warrant because you gotta have notices and publications and hearings. You gotta let bids and act on the bids. And so the process usually takes a couple months, and you're in a situation where you may need a little of that before that time.
So, we need to look at reducing things as much as we can, as soon as we can. So like, if we haven't have like buses to purchase yet, and we're still okay as far as the quality for our students to ride, we probably ought to opt out of maybe buying a bus or so. That'll help contribute into that. And then my second part is going into next year, there's no doubt we'll have to be redoing another tax anticipation warrant. Knowing the situation we're going to be in, should we just set that up for a full 12 months cycle?
I'll answer the second one first. Yes, it would probably be advised to do it for the year. Just do it once, do it for the year. In terms of the purchase of the bus, now you can use GO bonds to buy the bus, and in the future I would suggest that if you're going to buy a bus, if that's the vehicle that you use. No pun intended.
So again, with the solar project, the money being go against our utilities, the loan being that way, you're suggesting that we move that into debt service, and so that'll eliminate some of the, not that it eliminates everything, but it helps us free up some money in our operation or education.
Right, it's a double, it helps both the education and operations if you do that.
Thank you.
Mr. Coker? Yes. You want to ask your question? Would you give your name and address before you ask your question, please? You can go there.
My name's Pete Coker, I'm at Deer Creek Township. I was gonna touch on the transportation fund as far as the bus replacement program. There's actually, Doc Eiler brought up some points there that kind of changed my path here. So I'm kind of shooting from the hip. There's actually a VW trust fund that's come out with the bus replacement fund. You will not need to utilize the GEO bond. They are offering new 2017, 2020, there's new diesel emissions coming out. You can either repower or replace your existing units that you have in your fleet. That is the requirement. They're looking just strictly at the engine. They're not looking at the vehicle, so they don't care what vehicle you have. But you need to look at, instead of spending money, utilize this. The state of Indiana is going to receive $42 million from this VW trust grant. It is going to be distributed throughout schools, law enforcement, all throughout the state, NDOT, all that. To be divided up to meet the new criteria for diesel emissions. You can look at electric, which is a bad idea in this area. You can look at propane, which is a good idea. You can look at gas units, and you can look at the new 2020 emissions that are going to be coming out for diesel replacement. You don't have to touch the GEO bond, but you have to apply for it. You need to look at your cost of your expenses for the down there bus maintenance. You're paying some company more than twice what you had before. You're paying that outside company. You could go uptown here, purchase, for example, batteries on the school's account, but you're running through their account. They're charging you more money. We need to use common sense or, common sense. That's all I got you.
Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Pat Roberson. My sons and I do live out of district. I just have a couple questions and maybe one comment. Why are we missing reports and financial statements? And two, I'd like to ask that we make all these reports that you provided, Mr. Eiler, public, so we can look, so another can review it, because we're taxpayers, it's our money. And three, why is it going back 3 years, it was better than that, and now we're sort of turning over the edge here? It's a little bit, that's a question I have.
The big issue, I think, occurred in 2018. Last year, actually, in terms of the expenditures this year, they appear to be lower. But I don't know what expenses were made in 2018, particularly in capital projects fund, that changed your cash position. There are several things that have entered into the change in your cash positions. It is complicated in terms of trying to explain this simply. The simple answer is you spent some of your cash reserves in 2018. That's the simplest answer I can give you, and there are lots of reasons for it. There isn't any, I would not point an accusing finger at anybody. That's it. And there were some needs that never met and never paid.
And do we have proper signing authorities put in place? So if it's X dollars, it takes 2 signatures versus, $5,000 versus $50,000, or is it
One of the requirements that state work, when they do an audit, they make sure that you have proper internal controls, and you were not cited for not having them. So I can only assume that they didn't find any problems. And like normally, most districts have a procedure where multiple people have to approve the claim, and then the board actually has to approve it at a public board meeting before it's paid.
So your statement, or the question about 2 months ago, could we have averted this if we can do this, because we apparently changed accounting software missing July and August. So you're saying that we didn't see this coming earlier than 2 months ago? I mean, it's like all of a sudden we're falling off the cliff.
Well, I think you've had to change your treasurer. And so I don't know exactly when that occurred, but once that person was not here, I came in on July 26th, and within, I think, 2 weeks, I had suggested, oops, we need to do something here, because we have a cash flow issue. And so I tried to bring out the attention of people as quickly as I could. So I think, but you have an interim there where you really can have a treasurer who's monitoring cash flow of the district.
Are we engaged, I guess it's the question for the board, they don't have to answer, maybe a personnel issue. I hope we're engaging with someone like Mr. Eiler to monitor this process as we go through and get the ship right here, I guess.
I think you have a very competent interim treasurer. If you just be real nice to her, she'll hopefully help you.
And we will, put Mr. Eiler's presentation on the school website.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
There, so everybody can
Thank
see
you.
it.
Sean Asher, Jackson Township. If you go through the rainy day fund and use that, and you said you do that and another geo bond, were you looking how far into another geo bond we can get before it's done? I guess what I'm looking at is go through that and do geo bond where we can't do anymore, and then you have catastrophic failure of 2 or 3 boilers, or where are we at then? What can we borrow? How do we get out of that problem?
Two things is you are, as soon as you make your bond payments, you are reducing your geo bond indebtedness so that it frees up more money than you could issue in geo bonds. Absolute worst case scenario, if you exhausted your capacity to issue geo bonds, you could still issue bonds. They just would be first mortgage bonds and not geo bonds. It's a different process that you have to go through. That's an absolute worst case scenario. But there are other options. But given your capacity and the rate at which you're paying off your current bonds, you should still be able to retain. We're not talking, I wouldn't suggest a huge geo bond, but so you still have some geo capacity because you're constantly retiring that and replenishing your ability to issue bonds.
Any other questions from the board?
I guess referring to Mr. Schwarzkopf's question about bus replacement, I don't know if the public is aware of it, but through that Volkswagen grant, Delphi Community School Corporation is one of 4 corporations in the state that is eligible to receive a total electric bus. And it's also in conjunction with Duke Energy, who will supply the charging stations for them. And also, along with that charging station, we can use that bus to transport our athletic teams, if we want to the schools that are in our conference are willing to put charging stations in if we would need it. They have a range of 120 miles, which most of our schools are not that far away, so we could possibly use that to transport some of our athletes to some of the sporting events. So I just want to let everybody know that that's the thought behind possibly the electric bus, and we would be using it here in the city limits to transport students to school. So it should, according to Volkswagen and the bus company that's manufacturing, it's supposed to do what we ask it to do. So just want to throw that out there.
I'm going to touch on one thing, Chris, since you opened this up. I've been following this for several years. My recommendation to the school board, Greater Lafayette Public Transportation has electric buses down there right now. You need to research that information more. The last time, 2 years ago, the information I got, the range on those buses was 80 miles. You're gonna spend $430-some thousand per unit. I never, in almost 20 years working here, Not any Tom, Dick, and Harry can go in there and work on that unit. You gotta be trained. You have to know what the hell you're doing or you're dead. You're gonna die. And if a driver walks into that unit and they walk into someplace where they shouldn't be, they're dead. You need to research this better. You have other options to utilize that VW truck than an electric bus. You need to quit thinking like that. Delphi community is not an appropriate place for an electric bus. You need to go to Lafayette. You need to go to Indianapolis if you want to utilize electric bus. That's where they belong. They do not belong in a rural community. Period. I work on propane buses every day at Tiffany School Corporation. They range 250 miles. And I'm telling you right now, don't buy a propane bus. Don't do it. Stick with the diesel engine. You have the infrastructure here. You have the infrastructure nationwide for a diesel. You have the infrastructure for gas. You have the infrastructure of propane nationwide that is coming on. They're not there yet, but they're coming. Give them time. You do not have the infrastructure for electric bus in this state.